Good morning, everyone. Welcome to your writing lesson today. Let's begin with our learning target. I can write a fictional narrative story. A fictional narrative story is a story that is imaginative, it is not true, and it is strictly written to entertain your reader. It's just for fun. These stories do have beginnings, middles, and endings. They have characters, problems, solutions, settings. You can have two different kinds of fictional narrative stories. We've talked about this last week. You can have realistic fictional stories and unrealistic fictional stories. The realistic fictional stories are stories that have not happened, but they could happen in real life. So they're going to have real places, real people, real animals. But unrealistic fictional stories cannot really happen in real life. This is going to have made-up characters, made-up people, made-up places, and there's going to be events taking place that cannot happen in real life, like magic or talking animals. So we have been working on planning our first fictional narrative story. Let's review real quickly what our last writing lesson was about. We came up with the problem for our story. Now remember, the problem is something that the characters want to change, fix, or figure out. It can be a challenge. It can be trouble that the characters are facing. In our last writing lesson, we went ahead and tried to plan out what our characters in our fictional story were going to have to solve. So just a reminder, my problem was that Cody and Alex are going to be feeding the sheep in the petting zoo, and suddenly they discover that a goat is on the other side of the fence where it should not be. They must have left the door open. They don't have any more coins left to bring the goat back in with food, and they need to find a way to get the goat back into the enclosure inside of the pen before their teacher, Mr. Larson, or the zookeeper, Sarah, discovers what has happened. So remember, my story is about a little boy named Cody. He's 8. They're on a field trip at the zoo, and so he and his best friend Alex have went inside of this little goat at the little petting zoo, and they're in the goat pen and they're feeding the goat, and they realized when they went inside the gate that another goat snuck out and is on the wrong side of the fence. So this is their problem that they're going to solve in my fictional narrative story. Now, today what we're going to work on is a solution to that problem. We're going to plan the solution to that problem. A solution is the way that the characters solve the problem. It could be how they fix the problem. It could be how they address the issue. It could be how they face their challenge. So how does their problem get solved? Now, before we continue writing our solution to our story, I want us to read a mentor text titled, "I Don't Want to Be a Fish." As I read the story out loud, I want you to pay attention to the characters in the story, the setting, the problem, and today, the solution. And we're going to see if we can highlight and underline those parts of the story in the text. So, I don't want to be a fish. Once upon a time, in a huge ocean, there lived a small fish named Timothy. Timothy's mother told him to stay away from the sandy coast. She told him that it was not safe there. There were humans there. Even worse, there were birds. Timothy always went to the sandy coast anyway. He loved to watch the crabs walk on the sand all day. He thought that it would be so neat to have legs. The crabs could move quickly. Timothy wanted to be a crab. Timothy's grandma once told him that there was a magical oyster that would grant wishes. She said that if he brought the oyster a purple starfish, a piece of coral, and a feather from a bird, it would grant him a wish. Timothy worked for weeks getting the 3 items. He took them to the oyster. The oyster asked Timothy about his wish. "I'm tired of being a fish. I want to be a crab," Timothy said. "Are you sure? You may be sorry you made this wish," the oyster said. "I'm sure," Timothy said. Suddenly, Timothy was crawling around with the crabs. He could run quickly. He was so glad that he had legs. Having legs made him so happy. Out of nowhere, a big group of seabirds came swooping down. Timothy ran as fast as he could. The birds came down to grab at him again. He ran the other way to get away. He was scared. The birds flew down to get him again and again. "Help! What do I do?" Timothy yelled. "There's nothing you can do. We run back and forth all day to get away from the birds so that they don't eat us," one of the crabs yelled. Timothy could not believe this. All this time he had thought that the crabs ran because they loved their legs. However, They were running so that they didn't get eaten. Timothy began to cry. He missed his mother and grandmother. He missed swimming in the ocean. He missed feeling safe. I made a big mistake. My life as a fish was great. I don't want to be a crab anymore. I want to be a fish. Timothy cried. In a flash, Timothy was back in the ocean and swimming around. He was so thankful. He began swimming home to find his mom and grandma and give them a big hug. He was so happy to be home. He was so glad to be given a second chance. All right, let's go ahead. Now, this story is fiction. It has a beginning, middle, and end. It has characters, setting, problem, and solution. But this story is a fictional narrative. This is an unrealistic fictional story because animals can't talk. We can't go to an oyster with coral and feathers and starfish and turn into something that we're not. All that magic, that's unrealistic. That cannot happen. Let's go ahead and focus on the characters of the story. So the title is I Don't Want to Be a Fish. Well, Timothy is the one who's telling the story. There lived a small fish named Timothy. So the main character in this story is Timothy. We have other characters like his mother. We have his grandma is mentioned, Timothy's grandma. We have the oyster who he was talking to about that granted him the wish. So we have Timothy and then some secondary characters, his mom, his grandma, and the magic oyster. Now, as far as the setting, we need to be thinking about where and when does the story take place. If I look in the very first sentence, it says, once upon a time in a huge ocean, there lived a small fish named Timothy. So right in the very first sentence, it tells me where they are. He's in the huge ocean. Now, I'm not sure what type of day, what kind of day. It says he likes to watch the crabs walk in the sand all day. So I'm assuming that it's probably daytime, but he's in a huge ocean somewhere. That is the setting. Now, the problem is, what challenge is the character facing? What issue is he trying to overcome or address? So if I look, usually your problems happen in the middle of the story, but his problem is that he was tired of being a fish and he wanted to be a crab. It says he thought that it would be so neat to have legs. So his problem is he's tired of being a fish and he wants to be a crab so that he can run really fast. That's his problem. That's what he wants to address. So what does Timothy do in the story to address that problem? That will be the solution. And so the solution is, how does Timothy's problem get solved? So what Timothy did to help solve his swimming problem, or his way to get fast legs like a crab, was that he went to the magical oyster, and the magical oyster granted him a wish. And then at this part of the story, it says having legs made him so happy. Now, we know in this particular story, Timothy kind of ran into another problem. His second problem was that he figured out that having these legs wasn't all that he thought it was going to be, because he thought that the crabs were just running for fun because they liked their legs, but really they were just running to try to get away from the swooping birds. So we have Timothy in the ocean wanting to have legs like a crab. And then to solve his problem, he goes to the magical oyster and gets these feet these legs that he thinks he wants. So we have character, setting, problem, and solution. What we're going to do today is add or plan a solution to our problem. So remember, my character's problem in my story was that they're at the petting zoo, Cody and Alex. They're feeding the goats. They accidentally noticed that a goat got on the other side of the fence when they entered in. Their problem is to figure out a way to get the goat back in the pen without their teacher seeing them or the zookeeper seeing them. So my solution that I want to plan for my story is, how is Alex and Cody going to solve this problem? Or how are they going to solve this challenge? So this is what I came up with. Cody remembers reading about how goats like to eat anything they can get a hold of, including sweaters or pieces of paper. He suggests that Alex is in charge of opening and closing the gate. Cody will encourage the goat to come back into the enclosure with his sweater without letting him eat it. So the way that they're going to do it is, they're going to let Alex be in charge of opening the gate and closing the gate so that he can stay in. And then Cody is going to hold his sweater and try to lure the goat in back inside of the enclosure without letting his sweater get eaten. Remember, Cody is this 8-year-old boy who loves reading about animals, so he had read that in one of his books. So that we're going to use that to help them solve their problem, hopefully. So today, what you are going to do is I want you to think about the problem that you have planned for your fictional narrative story. And now today, I want you to think about how are they going to solve it. What ways is your characters in your story going to solve the challenge or the problem that you have already set up for them in our last writing lesson? So I want you to go ahead and plan out a way for your characters to solve their problem or overcome their challenge. Head on over to Seesaw and get started. Happy writing!